Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John. What's all this?
Martin, we have a serious topic to talk about today. So we've obviously seen catastrophic bushfires running through New South Wales and Victoria and parts of South Australia. We have tens of people who are either dead or missing. We have about 1,500 homes destroyed, catastrophic property damage, and we've seen about some of the estimates I've seen about 480 million animals who have been killed through these fires. So this is a catastrophic event that has happened, and perhaps one of the largest peacetime catastrophes in Australian history. And there's a lot of emotion, a lot of people very upset. One of the things that I think is important to highlight is that what has happened in the last month or so, because the intensity of the fires have actually escalated as more fires have started. What has happened, was avoidable. There was a series of warnings by one of Australia's leading experts on bushfires, and we're going to go through this person's resume and what this person has said on the record for a couple of decades, because his warnings about this have been completely ignored, and now we have seen, people basically losing their lives because experts in their own area of expertise not being listened to, politicians, bureaucrats in the mainstream media. And where I think this is sort of relevant for us is that, what we've been doing for the last year and a half is, in our area of expertise around economics and banking, we are talking about a catastrophic economic banking event coming forward because of excessive debt levels and not only in Australia but around the world. And our warnings are basically being ignored by the Reserve Bank, Treasury, APRA, etc. And so we think that we think that millions of Australians are going to suffer with when our forecast comes to play. And so, why I think it's relevant to call this out is that we have seen in the last 2 months what happens when bureaucrats and politicians just basically don't listen to expertise advice. Now, and one of the things that I will say is that so the title of the episode is somewhat provocative, Kath and Kim. Now, why did I choose this in terms of choosing this title? So when I think about Kath and Kim, what do I think about? I think about they're caricatures, but they're basically dumb, ignorant people who are disinterested, who are intellectually not curious, sort of people, And so you don't have to find working class bogans to have this sort of mentality. I think this closed-mindedness, not listening to alternative points of view. I think this is rife throughout Australian society. You can see this sort of behaviour and these characteristics among politicians, among senior bureaucrats, and basically, we've seen it even, with the Banking Royal Commission. Don't rock the boat. Don't ask any questions. We're just going to continue along our merry way. And if you say anything that's slightly different to the established norm, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a crank, etc. So the Kath and Kim, Kath and Kim's a metaphor. It's a mentality, it's a set of behaviours that you see on that show that is right throughout society. And I think these sort of behaviours has contributed to this bushfire catastrophe, but it has also contributed to, or it will contribute to, the economic crisis that we've been talking about for the last year and a half.
Okay, so you're drawing parallels essentially from two different domains to make the point that it's really important for people to listen to alternative views and opinions and not just get sucked into a single way of thinking, which becomes the mainstream, the only way of thinking, and then everything else is rejected.
Exactly.
Okay. Good. So we're going to talk about David Packham.
So David Packham, one of Australia's leading experts on in terms of bushfires. So just to go through his CV. So he qualified scientist, was awarded the Order of the Australian Medal for his work on bushfire management. From 1962 to 1980, he worked at the CSIRO as a scientist focused on bushfire research. He's worked, at Monash University. He was from 1980 to 1985. He was the director of the National Centre for Rural Fire Research. From 85 to 87, he worked as a deputy director at the Australian Counter Disaster College, which was part of the Department of Defence. He's worked as a senior research fellow at Monash University, and he's done a whole host of consultancy work. So this individual, I mean, he's not just some sort of crank. He's one of our leading people, and he's published over 53 research papers about bushfires. So rather than listening to people coming at this, from a point of, superficial knowledge. So just like you and I, we do a deep dive in our areas of expertise. With this guy, now he's retired, but he's been doing this for 50 years, and so he has, exceptional knowledge about this whole area. Now, in 2015. There was an inquiry in the Victorian Parliament. So the Inspector General for Emergency Management did an inquiry, and basically they were looking at the preparedness of Victoria for bushfires. And so, so I think after a series of decades where he's been warning about how we've been approaching land management and fuel loads, and how they contribute to bushfires, he put in a particular submission, and we'll put the submission up on the screen. And this submission actually has some very stark and blunt statements that I think that we need to alert the audience to, because when people say no one saw this coming, or perhaps this was due to a whole host of events, maybe perhaps like climate change. This person's saying something very different, and he said it many years before the event actually happened. So I'm going to read a series of statements from this submission that he put in 2015. So, quote: "We have a failed fire management policy and practice in southern Australia, especially Victoria. The thermal scale of wildfire in Victoria exceeds by a factor of 20 our ability to extinguish. Disaster scale wildfires occur once in every 30 years, but will become more frequent as fuel levels continue to rise. Southeast and southwest Australian fuel levels have risen over the last 3 decades as mismanagement has been imposed on our environment by misguided green ideology, political failure, and vested interests, and have now reached the most dangerous for the last 50,000 years. The threat is ignored. No government and its machinery is entitled to knowingly put citizens deliberately in harm's way. The current land management policy and practice put citizens in peril. Such acts with full knowledge of the consequences could fall within the definition of a crime against humanity, and when the next fire disaster occurs and perhaps thousands die in Victoria, those responsible should be referred to an international court." Now, these are explosive statements for anyone to make to a parliamentary inquiry, but this guy has 50 years of research behind him, worked at CSIRO, deep expertise, and he's just saying that the way we manage our land and how we've allowed these fuel loads in terms of scrubs and sort of deadwood and all of that to build up, that has been the reason why we have these uncontrollable catastrophic bushfires, and he's basically saying that the way government, particularly in Victoria, has managed this process has been completely wrong. And this failure to manage this is the key contributing factor for why we have the catastrophe that we have today.
And that's worth saying. That was in 2015.
2015.
Right? So before the current events.
Before the current events.
Yep.
But obviously we've had a series of catastrophic bushfires over the last few decades. Whether in 1983 with Ash Wednesday, 2003 that looked at sort of southern New South Wales, at Canberra and Victoria, 2009 with the Victorian fire. So this guy has been all over this issue for a long time, and he's just said that the current way of approaching managing the amount of sort of fuel loads in these state forests has been completely wrong, and this is the main factor. And he's basically saying that people in the know, so that these fire chiefs, governments, bureaucrats, certain people in the media knew that this was knew his view, knew that that what they were doing was wrong. People are now dead. And he said that people knowingly put citizens in this country in harm's way, and they should be referred to an international court. And so, who am I as a non-expert to question someone who could see the crisis coming, put in a submission into a parliamentary inquiry, has deep scientific expertise, and basically saying, "I told you so," and if you had listened to me, this could have all been averted.
Makes you think, doesn't it? I wonder what other else you could apply that to. Armageddon?
Potentially. So a lot of people in our area of expertise will basically dismiss us until the crisis actually occurs.
Yep.
But we'll continue to talk about the economic Armageddon coming over the next few months, because we've got a lot to say about what's happening in that area. But in terms of David Packham, so we actually have some footage. So after the 2009 bushfires in Melbourne, in Victoria, he actually gave an interview on a current affair. And so when it came to a particular council, so the Nillumbik Council, the residents, the Taxpayers Association for that council area, basically engaged David to do a basically assessment about the risk around bushfires. He basically said it was quite bad. He then said get a second opinion, and the second opinion said came in with a stronger opinion saying this is catastrophic risk. This evidence was presented to the local council. The council did nothing around backburning, around fuel loads or anything. And then when the 2009 bushfires happened, that particular council area was one of the most affected areas, because this person's professional opinion was basically ignored. So let's actually play David talking to Tracy Grimshaw from Channel 9, where they actually go through some of this detail.
Well, there's been a lot of debate this week about some councils' green policies, about fuel reduction methods and measures and whether there was enough, and also the fight or flee policy. And here to talk with me about some of those issues is David Packham, who's a former CSIRO bushfire scientist. David, you're an expert. You warned Nillumbik Council, which takes in St Andrews and Arthurs Creek, where there were deaths on Saturday, about their pro-tree policy, 6 years ago?
Yes, that would be right.
What did they say?
Well, they didn't really say much. It was the Nillumbik Ratepayers Association were uncomfortable with the fire threat, and they asked me to do an assessment. When I did an assessment, I said they should get a second opinion, which was an independent opinion, and that opinion was tougher than mine. It was just a disaster and a terrible situation, probably the worst I've seen anywhere, probably in the world, except near Los Angeles.
So did the council question your logic, or did they simply ignore what you had to say because they didn't like what you had to say?
There was a hearing, and the hearing just said thank you very much, and the council did absolutely nothing but continued on with their, in my view, absolutely irresponsible, shall we say, green policies.
Do you believe these policies contributed to these fires?
Absolutely, without the slightest doubt. Because to get a disaster fire like this, you've got to have three things. You've got to have bad weather, we had it. You've got to have ignitions, we always have them. And you have to have extensive quantities of very heavy, neglected fuels. And boy, we had that, especially in Nillumbik.
You know how big this is that you're saying, because people died in this area.
Oh yes, I'm well aware of that. This is a repeat of what has been going on since Hobart was destroyed in 1967. This looks like so much of Hobart. We're slow learners. We're taking a long time to come to the right conclusion, which is look after your fuels. Okay,
so but in terms of fuel reduction, it's not just green groups that oppose fuel reduction. A lot of residents in leafy green areas like their bush around them.
Well, they do have a choice. They can have little bits of annoyance when the fuel reductions are going on from time to time, or they can have what we see here. And I don't know about them, but I know which choice I would make and have made.
There will be a Royal Commission into this. It will presumably go through all of these questions. Do you believe that the Royal Commission will find failures at a local government and a state government level?
Well, in terms of fuel management, they will, or it will. It must, because there's no alternative. That's just absolute. In terms of what people did during the time, there have been some wonderful and heroic and appropriate things. People have all performed as well as they possibly could. But these forces of nature are just so big. The fires we've had in Victoria have been equal in energy release to 660 Hiroshima bombs. Now, no amount of helicopters or yellow uniforms are going to change that.
I think there's no question that we've heard some remarkable stories of
Yes.
heroism and wonderfully good things that were done
Yes.
on Saturday. But I guess the point of the Royal Commission is to learn from the mistakes, and you think you've got a finger on the mistakes.
Oh, well, there is one outstanding mistake which has been found by the House of Representatives inquiry in 2003 and by the Victorian Parliamentary inquiry, which gave its report only 6 months ago. You must manage your fuels or you'll have these disasters.
David, what about the fight or flee early policy? I mean, some people found their very best laid fire plans, literally went up in smoke.
It's a highly stressful situation. It's an area in which you cannot afford to make a mistake. It's an area also in which you've had no previous experience. Now, I'm one of the authors of the fight or flee, and I do believe that careful, honest research has got to evaluate every death here, and that policy has got to be validated or altered or, if necessary, rejected. I'll be very surprised if it doesn't turn out, with careful, honest work, to be shown to be the most appropriate policy. Common sense would tell you that the alternative of dumping everybody onto the roads and having to get them out of the area in an hour or two just can't happen, and you'll have people caught on roads much more than now, and the death tolls will not be 100 or so, or 200, or what I heard tonight, 300, but it will be measured in the thousands. We have to keep people sheltered during the passage of the flame.
All right, David, you drove 3 hours to be with us tonight. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
That's all right. Okay, well, thank you.
No worries.
Good day.
David Packham, we'll be back with...
Okay, well, that's pretty shocking.
Indeed. So I mean, I find it extraordinary how you have someone with this level of knowledge who has consistently said that how we manage land, how we manage these fuel loads is the primary factor, and yet he keeps on warning people, he keeps on calling it out. And we have this Kath and Kim mentality of ignorance, of being intellectually not curious, and we're just going to ignore scientific expertise, and we're just going to continue down a particular road path. I mean, this just seems like lunacy. And you and I have been banging our head about our sort of set of issues with the economy, and yet on this issue, it's the same sort of behaviours that we're seeing, and people have suffered significantly from this, we should be better than this.
So he's actually made a number of different statements in different spheres quite recently, hasn't he?
Yes. So we just quoted what he said in 2009 with Channel 9. We also talked about what he said in 2015. So in the last couple of months, he's given a series of interviews on radio and TV where he's continued to bang on about the same issue. And so I think it's worthwhile to even review some of his latest comments, just to prove that this person is quite consistent in terms of warning about certain issues, and those catastrophic events happening. So David gave an interview with SBS, and this was on the SBS website. So let's actually put that up on the screen for people to have a look at. So I'm just going to read a couple of things from this SBS interview where he sort of gives his most recent opinions. So quote, likening the bushfire disaster in New South Wales to climate change is absolute nonsense, and reducing fuel loads in the Australian bush is urgently needed, a leading scientist says. It's absolute nonsense, he told AAP. The very best interpretation is it's misguided by them not understanding how bushfires actually do work in Australia. If there is any global warming, the global warming is so slow and so small that the bushfire event is totally overrun by the fuel state. He says fuel loads are now the heaviest they have been since human occupation of the continent, and Aboriginal methods need to be adopted. There's been this determination over the last 10 to 20 years to not treat our country in the same way Indigenous people treated it for 30,000 years. Now, there's a whole controversy around climate change. I mean, this is not necessarily the forum for it. Now, he's a bushfire expert. He's not a climatologist. So people will take a view on climate change, and I don't have a particularly strong view one way or the other. But basically, he's saying if climate change did have a contributing factor, in his professional assessment, that factor is quite minor compared to the principal issue, which is about land management and the build-up of all these fuel loads. One of the things, because I've listened to quite a few of his interviews prior to talking to you today. So one of the things that Indigenous Australians did before European occupation was that there was, they would, continually burn forests using very small fires, so that you'd have constant regeneration of the forests, but also you would have sort of a lot of this fuel load being reduced. So we haven't done that, and there's been some controversy around the frequency of backburnings and how we've been doing these backburnings. But basically, he's saying that we've allowed over 20-30 years that for these fuel loads to grow to quite high levels, and the amount of fuel in these forests, once they get lit, that's what's causing these fires to run out of control.
And it's quite interesting because, you could argue that the big picture on climate change, whichever way you go with the argument, is going to be very hard to influence the outcomes of. But if there are actionable things that can be done around land clearance and bush control, those are actually things we can do now.
Correct.
And if we had done them, we perhaps wouldn't have been in the situation that we're in now.
Absolutely.
That's the shocking revelation of this.
Yes. Now, he also has given he gave a recent interview on the 11th of November with Andrew Bolt on Sky News. So he had a couple of very interesting things to say on that interview. So I just want to go to his quotes there. So, quote, "We now have fuels that are about 10 times greater than what the Aboriginals had when colonisation took place in Australia. If you increase the fuel 10 times than what it should be, which is the case now, your fire intensity is 100 times greater. This equates to 70 megawatts per metre. The maximum you can extinguish is 3. So basically he's saying that compared to 1788, the amount of fuel in these forests is 10 times what it was before European colonisation, and yet no matter how much resources we give the rural fire service, we just humanly do not have the capacity to extinguish these fires, because these fires are so intense, so powerful, because there is just so much fuel."
So one interesting question I've got, John, is whether the fire season is actually longer than it used to be, right? And does it start earlier? All those things that people keep saying.
Yes. So when it comes to the climate change debate, some people have said that and even some of the former fire chiefs have actually said that the fire season has actually now extended, and that's made it harder to actually sort of manage in terms of some of this crisis. Now, the interesting thing on this is that David Packham actually has data going back to the 1920s based on CSIRO data, and basically what he's found is so he actually gave a quote on this Andrew Bolt interview, so I'll read it now. So it goes, quote, "What we are experiencing now in October and November, there are huge fires going back to 1921 and 1929, which shows that this is the peak bushfire time in New South Wales. Queensland, it is a little bit earlier, and in Victoria, it is yet to come." So even on these new claims about the climate change may have an issue around the seasonality about when these bushfires happens. I mean, going back to more than a century of data, he just says that some of these new claims are being sort of they don't stack up to historical evidence. So again, there's a lot of people, I think, jumping to conclusions about all sorts of things about what causes these fires, what causes the intensity, when are these fires occurring. And yet one of the most prominent experts in this area just saying that a lot of these claims, they don't stack up. So I think it's, again, important that we listen to people with expertise, and not to necessarily accept everything they say on face value, but we need to be at least open-minded, particularly when you have people who have been predicting these catastrophic events for years and for decades, and their warnings continue to be ignored. Now, who is one of the key groups that continues to ignore people like David Packham? It's the fire services, it's these fire chiefs. And so now there's been a set of behaviour that these fire chiefs have exhibited, which in another interview with 2GB, David Packham sort of goes into some detail. So basically he says that every time there's a catastrophic failure of fire control policy, all you see is from these fire chiefs and from the fire rural services is call for more resources. So, and even though we give them more, the governments give them more resources, these fires continue to happen again and again to these catastrophic scales. And the key point that David is saying is that they don't have to happen to the scales that they are. So he actually goes into a bit of conversation on 2GB to explain this sort of circular sort of set of behaviour with the fire chiefs. So let's actually play what he had to say there.
Every time the policy of fire control fails, and it's been failing all the time. Ash Wednesday, 1983. 2003, when even Canberra burnt, the 3 million acres burnt, 3 million hectares burnt between Victoria and New South Wales, and pretty much a contiguous fire. Ever since then, these are total failures, and ever since then, the argument has been put up by the fire chiefs that give us more resources, give us more money, give us more aeroplanes, give us more radios, and we will fix the problem. And every time it fails, and every time they ask for more. Well, now they've had the whole East Coast burn on them, and so we'd better find something to blame. Oh, it's all climate change. Isn't that convenient? So I don't know what's going on, but I find it incredible that such dedicated, intelligent people can talk so much stuff that is absolutely dangerously wrong.
Okay, so there's a series of activities that are repeating themselves.
So what I think what he's really getting at is he's saying that no one's focused on prevention. Everyone is everyone is reactive when the crisis happens, and then when the crisis happens, people try to shift blame, and then they always just say we need more resources to actually deal with the issue so it doesn't happen again. And yet it is happening again. So why is this set of behaviour happening throughout Australian society? Whether it's about the economy, whether it's about bushfires, people have to acknowledge that there is, Kath and Kim it may not just be fiction. There may be something more to this mentality that's going throughout Australian society, and because of this, we have just seen catastrophic event happen, and to the video you just put out on Walk the World, in terms of, well, people had no cash, so what happened? There was looting, there was theft. So the things that we see in the third world that have happened here in New South Wales, and we're supposed to be this sophisticated first world sort of society, and yet when things really get prickly, we've just seen a trial run of how societal collapse can even happen here in Australia.
Well, there's a very famous writer who said that culture and civilization is a very thin veneer that cracks very easily under pressure, right? And of course, we've seen that example.
Exactly. So to bring this conversation to close, Martin, so I think there's a few things to point out to the audience. First thing is that we've just seen one of the biggest catastrophic natural disasters in Australian history. Scientific experts have been warning that this was going to happen for years. Ministers and senior bureaucrats did not listen to these warnings. And in my opinion, so this expert David Packham said these people need to be referred to a court. I think we're not going to get real change in government until politicians and bureaucrats go to jail for basically gross negligence or incompetence. And this is what I've said about people at the RBA. If we see a catastrophic economic event, people at the RBA, Treasury, APRA, Parliament, people need to go to jail and be held accountable for basically not listening to people with an alternative point of view who actually are pretty, cluey and knowledgeable in their area of expertise. So I think it's another important thing is that the mainstream media in general continues to push particular narratives which may not be backed up by the best research possible. And then when you do have certain experts who have a different point of view, so obviously this guy says it's not climate change, it's about how we manage land, and we're managing land in a particular way because of a particular sort of environmental point of view. Well, there are certain groups within the mainstream media who don't want that perspective to be put out there, and yet the warning, the catastrophe that he warned about has actually happened. So I think that when you warn about something big about to happen and it happens, the people who could see this years in advance should be given more credibility, and yet the mainstream media in this country don't do that, including the ABC, which I think is a shame in and of itself. So without being too controversial, I think Australia is being run by a whole bunch of dumb, ignorant, closed-minded, and incompetent people, just like we saw with the Kath and Kim show. Don't
hold back.
Well, I mean, the thing is, when you see what has happened, no. I think we just need to put all the cards on the table. And when these things happen, you see people deflect. You see the establishment trying to say, it's not us. It's this issue, it's that issue, and yet they had the power all along to stop these things from happening, and yet that didn't happen. So it comes down to, well, what is this channel about, and what are we trying to do? I mean, we're trying to do, something of what David Packham did in his area of expertise, in our area of expertise, and yet, people think we're cranks, we're conspiracy theorists, we're doom gloomers, whether it's Switch of Joy and a whole bunch of other people, but I am convinced, based on my research, based on economic history, that a significant economic crisis is coming, and this crisis is going to be, the effects of this crisis will be much more severe than in terms of what was happened with this bushfire, and yet we still have an opportunity to get things happening in government so that the effects of the economic crisis is not as severe as what it has to be, and yet we continually are ignored. And we'll obviously see about the cash ban and whether our warnings about about these sort of new laws coming forward, whether they're going to be ignored by parliamentarians or not. But based on what we've seen on this bushfire sort of field, it doesn't give me much hope that we're going to learn the lessons and we're going to avoid economic catastrophe over probably the next 2 or 3 years.
And what it really says is that the people who are calling the shots aren't necessarily the ones who are best informed.
Correct.
They are tending to look after their own positions and to protect their particular points of view. They tend to use media and spin and deflect, rather than wanting to tackle the fundamental issues that they should be tackling. And that behaviour, as you say, is quite widely spread, not just, I guess, in Australia, but certainly in Australia. And we see that around the bushfires, we see that around economics, and we see that around the the financial situation that we're in. So I think what you're saying is there is a small window of opportunity to think and behave and act differently. But if we don't, then disaster waits.
Absolutely.
John, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people, we'll see you next time.